Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today we are going to start on our character assignment. Now to start, we are going to be taking a bit of a detour from Maya. Don't worry, we'll go back to it next week, but for now I want to take us through a different software called Blender. Blender is essentially a lot like Maya, but it is open source, it is free. It does a few things that Maya doesn't do. Maya does a few things that Blender doesn't do. They're very similar, but I like to use Blender specifically for its sculpting tools. So today we are going to be delving into those to start modeling our character's head. When you start up Blender, you might get a screen like this. There will be a couple different options. Go ahead and leave these as is. If you really want to, you could change your theme to something like this, or even make it look like Maya. But that could get confusing very quickly, so I'm just going to keep it on Blender Dark. After that, it'll give us the option to create a new file with preset workspaces for different workflows. I'm just going to go ahead and create a new file with the sculpting preset. So then right away it puts us into sculpting mode. It gives us a sphere that we can sculpt on, and it displays all of our sculpting tools for us on the left-hand side here. There is a lot that we could explore in Blender. It's about as robust and large as Maya, but I really want to hone in on only the things that we need to sculpt our character head. So for starters, Blender works in different modes depending on what workflow you're working in. So we've started in sculpting mode, but we could just as easily go to object mode, which is similar to Maya's object mode, where you select whole objects and can move them around pretty simply. We also have an edit mode, and this is essentially the equivalent of Maya's like vertex mode, edge mode, or faces mode. And then you can specify which component you want to be altering with these boxes up here for vertices, edges, and faces. There's a few other modes here: vertex paint, weight paint, texture paint. We're not going to worry about those. The three we're going to be concerned with today are object mode, edit mode, and sculpt mode. And sculpt mode is a more organic way to sculpt your geometry rather than sort of the tedious method of selecting vertices and moving them around and extruding faces. Sculpting mode works a bit more like you might actually physically sculpt with clay, is the way I like to think of it. So for example, I have my draw tool selected, and I can paint on top of this mesh, and it starts to draw out the vertices and make them come out of the mesh further. And if I hold Control while doing a brush stroke, it will push inwards instead. It will do the reverse of what my brush normally does. This is where I would highly recommend that you use your drawing monitors with your pens, because sculpting is a lot more organic, and the sculpting tools actually use your pen's pressure sensitivity. So before we get into all the tools, I just want to show you a couple of things. Up here in the top right, we have our symmetry. It looks like a little butterfly. And we can turn on symmetry on the X, Y, or Z axes. It's important to note that Y and Z are actually reversed as opposed to the way they are in Maya. So keep that in mind as you work between the two programs. You'll notice this in a lot of 3D software and game engines where the Y and the X are flip-flopped. So just something to keep in mind if things start acting weird when you're transferring between programs. Either Maya to Blender, or Blender to Unity, or Unity to Maya, etc. Next to your symmetry is the dynamic topology toggle, or Dyne Topo. What this basically does is, while you are painting, when this is off, it is not adding or removing any vertices or faces or anything. It is simply moving things around. However, if you turn this on, now it adds geometry or removes geometry based on the needs of your sculpt. if you click on the little arrow and get this little drop down, you can change some details about how it is adding geometry. One of the most important ones is going to be your detailing, which basically defines the method which Blender uses to determine how much detail to place on your sculpt when you are sculpting. So it starts with relative detail, and the amount of detail it adds is relative to the brush size. You can also have a constant detail, a brush detail, manual detail. Go ahead and play around with these and see how they feel. I like to generally have a constant detail, and now by default it has given me a really low resolution of 3, so I am going to make that something higher. And I'll always have a pretty consistent level of detail as I'm sculpting. Generally, when sculpting, you want to start low. I mean, just like when you're modeling normally, you want to start with less geometry and then add as you go. So maybe I should be working at 10 for now, and later I can refine my detail later. Just above my Dyn Topo option, I have the toggle X-ray. This works just like in Maya. You can turn an X-ray to see through your model. Right next to that, similar to Maya, we can turn on a wireframe mode, or we can go to viewport shading. The next two are material preview and render view. We don't need to worry about these for now because we're not going to be rendering anything or doing any materials in Blender. All we need to worry about are your regular viewport shader and your wireframe. Most of the viewport shader. Alright, before I forget, let's talk about camera movements. Every camera movement in Blender is controlled by your middle mouse click. So if you hold down middle mouse by itself, you can rotate around. If you hold down shift and then on middle mouse, you can pan. If you hold on control and middle mouse, you can zoom in and out. And if you hold alt and middle mouse, you can quickly flip between your orthographic views. You can also access your orthographic views by clicking these little axes up here. It might take a little while to get used to camera movements in Blender because they're a little bit different than Maya. Done with the middle mouse click. If you are using a pen, which I hope you are, I would recommend changing one of your side buttons to middle mouse click, just so you have access to that all the time. Just to the right of your axes handles, we have what is essentially the equivalent of the outliner from Maya. You can find all your objects in the scene here. You can even group things together in collections. These are essentially the same thing as groups in Maya. Every time you open up a Blender scene, you'll actually start with a light and a camera, but I don't really want those, so I'm going to go ahead and delete those. So I can do that by pressing right click and hitting delete. Same thing there. Okay, so now I want to add in my reference images. So to do that, I am going to go into my object mode, and I'm going to add my reference images. This is just like in Maya when you add an image plane. I'm going to go into my orthographic view. I'm going to go to add, image, reference. So I've already made a project folder in Maya to keep my images in. So I'm actually going to access that. So go into my character project, go to source images, and I'm going to grab one of my model sheet views. I'm going to load reference image. And if I were to change my view, you can see there's an object in the scene, just like an image plane in Maya. I'm going to go ahead and go to my next view. Do the same thing, image, reference, model sheet, side. And I want to add my back image, but I don't want them to overlap with my front image. So I'm going to move this image plane backwards. Now, how do I do that? The hotkeys in Blender are pretty different for transformations. So to move something, instead of W, I'm going to hit G. After I hit G, my image plane will snap to my mouse in relation to the camera and will begin to follow it around. This is very different from Maya, where you press W and it will just create handles that you move around afterwards. However, this isn't very helpful if I just want to move along the X, Y, or Z axes. So to move on a particular axis, I actually hit the key for that axis. So I want it to move on the Y axis. I'm going to hit Y, and now it only moves along the Y axis. I can do the same thing with the Z axis or the X axis. And if I held Shift and then 2 different axes together, I can move along 2 axes together. So I'm going to move this back just a little bit. And then finally, I'm going to go back to this view. I'm going to go to Image, Reference, and add my last view. And move this back. Actually, no, I think I want to move these all back together again real quick. So what I want to do next is I'm going to scale up all of my images so that the head matches my initial sphere a bit better. So to move things, it was G, and that basically stands for grab. So it follows that the other transformations also follow similar logic. So to rotate things around, you can hit R, and it will spin around. And same thing, press X, Y, or Z, and to rotate on different axes. If you don't want to commit to a transformation, you could always press right click and it will snap back to how you had it before you moved it. And then if I want to scale something, I will press S. I will make everything scale up. Once again, I could scale on the Z, or the X, or the Y, but I don't want that. If you would like to change the location, rotation, or scale of any of your objects in your scene, you can go over here to this little orange box labeled Object Properties. And from here you can change your rotation, your scale, and your location. Pressing G again, and then pressing Z, I'm going to drag down. I'm going to toggle on my X-ray. I'm just going to keep scaling up and dragging down until I get to approximately what I want. Certainly doesn't need to be exact at all because we are going to be sculpting this and adding and subtracting from this geometry, but I think this is pretty good for now. I'm going to deselect that. And I'm going to go over here and give each of these a name. And also I'm going to move these into position around my model. Okay, and then I could go to my orthographic views. And it's, well, now my reference image is in the way. Even with my X-ray view, I cannot see through the image planes. So what do I do about this? Well, I am going to select one of my reference images. And then I'm going to go down here to Object Data Properties and click that. And here we have a opacity slider. And I can turn that on. And now the X-ray works with the reference images. And now I can slide down the opacity so that I can see through even more clearly. And I can even turn off my X-ray now if I like. Go ahead and go to the other 2 image planes and do the same. I'm going to give them all an opacity of 25. And there you are. I think I'll go ahead and move the back reference to the back, actually. And front to the front. So before I get to sculpting, though, one more thing. I want to save my scene. To do that, I'm going to go up to File. And we're going to hit Save. And then I'm going to navigate to my Maya project. I go to Scenes, and I'm going to save it in my Scenes folder just so that I have everything in one place. So I'm going to give this a name, call it Head Sculpt. .tf for my initials, and .001. Just like Maya, Blender also has a incremental save feature. When you save files, you can hit the plus or the minus sign to increment the number up and down. I'm going to hit save Blender file. And then anytime I want to do an incremental save, increase that number. So you have lots of versions. Just like in Maya, it's always good to be saving frequently and be saving many different iterations. If I want to hide my reference collection, I can hit the I here, and now I have just the ball. With it selected, I'm going to go to my Sculpt tool, turn on the symmetry, and I'm going to get started with the tools. So our first tool is the Draw tool, like we saw before. If you just draw, it will add to your mesh. If you hold Control, it will subtract from your mesh. And then if you hold Shift, it will smooth out your mesh. There is also a Smooth tool, which we will review later, down here, if you just want to select it outright. If you want to change the properties of your tool, you go over here to the right and click Active Tool and Workspace Settings. It's this little wrench and a screwdriver. And here you have all sorts of settings for radius, strength, hardness, and so on and so forth. Also, if you don't want to go to these tools and you just want to change the size of your brush, you can either hit the bracket keys, just like in Photoshop, to scale your brush up and down. Or you can hit F, and you can drag your mouse and scale your brush that way. Next step is the Draw Sharp tool, which by default sort of makes an indent in your model, sort of like drawing on top of it. You hold Control, it will extrude instead. After that, we have the Clay tool, which just sort of adds on top of your mesh, similar to the Draw tool, but in more of a way that simulates adding clay on top. And similar to that, we have Clay Strips, which is kind of the same thing, but it has a bit more of a square appearance. I really like this tool, just kind of a personal preference. After that, we have the Clay Thumb tool, which kind of acts like as if you are using your thumb to sort of add a bit of clay, but also move things around with your thumb. You can build it up like so. After that, we have the Layer tool. And what the Layer tool does, it's very similar to the Clay Strips tool, but it preserves the details rather than just adding on top. So if you just want to raise your details up or press your details in, you can use the Layer tool. Next up, we have the Inflate tool, which, as it implies, it will simply inflate a part of your mesh and kind of make this bulbous shape. Similarly to that, we also have the Blob tool, which is kind of the same thing, but a bit more of an extreme fashion. If you hold Control while using this tool, it'll make sort of a concave space in your mesh. Next up, we have the Crease tool, which essentially is kind of like the Draw Sharp tool, but it has a bit more of a pinch effect to the surrounding geometry around it. So it's a little bit hard to see, but if you zoom in, you can really see there's a crease being formed as I go along. You can even smooth this out and then go again and get an even finer crease. If you hold control, you can get more of a pinch to your crease rather than an indentation. This is really good for getting some hard edges. Next up, we have the smooth tool. And this is, of course, again, if you hold shift, it's the same exact thing. But if you actually select the smooth tool, you can change the settings of it, like the strength of your smoothing. The tools are pressure sensitive if you're using a pen, which I highly recommend. But if you wanted to smooth out like this, if you really just want a little bit of smooth, you could go lightly with a light strength. It'll be a very light effect. And these settings will persist if you were to, say, change your strength down and then go to your draw tool, but then hold shift. The settings persist from your changes to the smooth tool. Next up, we have the flatten tool. That works as you would expect. It just flattens out an area. Make this bigger. Let's give myself a little more space here. You can grab and drag out the tools so you can get 2 rows of icons. Or if I drag out further, I can actually see the names of each tool. I'm going to go ahead and keep it at this 2 icon view. I think this is the cleanest look. Next up, we have the fill tool, which will basically fill in any areas that as you go over it, any holes, any crevices, that sort of thing. We also have the scrape tool, which will let you scrape away at things. It works especially well if you have anything sort of protruding, like an edge like this. Just scrape it down. Following that, we have the multi-plane scrape, which works kind of like the scrape tool, but with multiple planes. And that will be really obvious once I use it. You can see there's these red rectangles that are sort of guiding my edge that it's making. It is essentially flattening on 2 planes and making this really sharp edge. If I increase the size, I'll get even more flattening. I can go over here to my settings and change the plane angle and get a different angle that's a little bit less extreme or more extreme, like this. And if I can hold control, it will switch to a single plane and flatten out that way. Next up, we have the pinch tool. This works similarly to the crease tool, but in reverse. I can get really emphasize those edges I already have. Or I can add in new edges. It really draws the geometry together. And if I go over a crease, I can really kind of close that crease while maintaining that line. Next, we have the grab tool. And this is where we get into the ones that are really just about moving things around. So the grab tool will grab a bit of geometry, move it around in relation to your camera. Next, we have the elastic deform, which works very similar to the grab tool, but it simply grabs a lot more. It's basically like a soft selection. After that, we have the snake hook. And what this will do is it will continually make more and more faces to accommodate for my grab until it really just runs out. So you can make these sort of snaking shapes. Be careful because if you go too far out, it will kind of run out of geometry. And you may need to go in with your draw tool and add to it. But you'll notice that at this level, it really only wants to extend in one direction. So it's actually so thin, it's going to cause problems. So draw tool isn't the way to fix that. Probably the best way to fix this would be with your inflate tool to kind of give you that surface again to work with. If you ever have an issue where it seems like something is too thin or it's sort of reverted in on itself, the inflate tool is really good for fixing those kind of problems. Next up is the thumb tool, which works kind of like the clay thumb tool, where it lets us thumb things around, but it's a little less additive than the clay thumb tool. It's more so just for moving things around. Next up we have the pose tool, but first I'm going to start with my snake hook, because I'm going to need something kind of like an arm to work with to make this tool work. So there we go. I'm going to go ahead and inflate this a bit. So now I've got what looks kind of like an arm. I'm going to go to my pose tool. And what this does is it analyzes what you are moving or about to move. And it tries to figure out where to actually rotate around, as if it were a limb with an elbow or a knee or some kind of joint. So this would be really useful if you were, say, sculpting an entire character in Blender and you haven't added a rig or anything, you just want to move your limbs around. You can kind of get an estimate of where that elbow would be and move based on that. And you can even move as if like that were the shoulder. And then after you're done, you come in here and maybe come in with your fill tool, scale it down a bit, fill that back in. Or you could hold shift and smooth it out. After that we have the nudge tool, which is another one of those tools where it's just about moving kind of details around. The nudge tool will not really change the volume of your object. Like I can't pull this out, but I can move the crease around along the surface that already exists. After that we have the rotate tool, which, as the name implies, will let me rotate my mesh around. You definitely want to be careful with this one though, because you can't really go around like this. It stretches out your geometry. And then if I want to go back and smooth it out, it will just sort of revert. So use this conservatively. There's some more tools here. I'm not going to go into most of the rest of these because we don't really need them. They'll add complication to things. The last one I want to talk about is the mask tool. Now the mask tool, you can come in here and paint on your mesh, and wherever it is dark now, you cannot move. So you can't accidentally move around, and then I can paint around it, and that geometry is safe, essentially. So you can go in with your mask tool like that. There is also a marquee select here with box mask. If you hold control, you can undo your mask. You could also use this tool next to it, which is the box hide, which will basically hide some geometry. But I would be careful with that because you might forget where you have some geometry. If you want to bring it back though, you can just hold control, marquee select to bring it back. Great, so that's all the tools. I'm going to go ahead and bring back my reference. And then I want to get a fresh sphere. So I'm going to go back to object mode. I'm going to select this and delete it. Now I'm going to go up to add. I'm going to go to mesh, And I'm going to go bring in a UV sphere. And then with that UV sphere selected, I'm going to go back here up and go to sculpt mode. Also, you can swap between modes by hitting tab. Generally, it'll go between sculpt mode and edit mode. Or if you have object mode selected, it'll go between object mode and edit mode. So if you ever accidentally switch between modes, it might be because you hit tab. So I'm going to go back to sculpt mode and turn on my Dyne Topo. And then I'm going to go to my orthographic view and I'm going to get to sculpting. So starting from my front view, making sure my Dyne Topo is on, because sometimes it gets turned off. Now, be aware that sometimes your Dyne Topo gets turned off if you switch between sculpt mode and edit mode and object mode. So just be checking, make sure it's on. Make sure your symmetry is on as well. And I'm just going to start sort of feeling this out. Make sure to add a lot of geometry. I'm going to grab. Or no, I'm going to use my elastic deform. Just kind of pull up. Sort of find the shape of her skull a little bit from this perspective. I'm not going to get too attached to this view yet because it looks kind of nightmarish from this side. I'm going to go to my side view. Use my sculpt draw to kind of add back here and smooth it out. Use my elastic deform again to pull things out this way. Just really trying to get a basic head shape going that we can start from. Using my smooth tool a lot. I want to start as broadly as possible. Push these together, kind of make that chin. You're definitely going to sit with this for a while, and it's just going to not look quite right for a while. And that's okay. This is a very iterative process. So just kind of get it looking like this at first. Don't worry about the details yet. We're going to sculpt her hair as well, but it's going to be a separate sculpt. So I'm not going to worry about that just yet. Go back to my side view. Holding control, I'm going to try and subtract, kind of get that bridge of the nose. Go to my grab tool. Bring her to the array edge. Pull out for the nose. Push in underneath the nose. Push in for the lips a bit. This side. I know that doesn't look right. Use my draw tool. Smooth out. And check my view back there, but I don't have to go into orthographic every time. I just kind of use it as a reference. Use my control to push in. Use some eye sockets. Go to my orthographic front view. Really just kind of press in like this. Looks a bit scary, but that's okay. It'll look fine later. Smooth that out a bit. lot of push and pull. Really try to think of it like clay. This is not your mechanical process of modeling like we would normally. And subtract from kind of her chin. Looks like her chin and cheeks have gotten too wide. Just kind of smooth those out. It's kind of weird from these other angles, so I'm going to correct. Pull it all in like this. So now we made a bit of progress. It would be nice to have some eyes now. The eyes we're going to keep separate from the rest of the sculpt, just so that we can maintain a pretty round shape. So I'm going to go up here to add. We'll go down to mesh, UV sphere, and click that. I'm going to turn my X-ray, and then I'm going to go ahead and go into edit mode because we want to move these vertices without moving the pivot. So we're going to move all of these vertices. I'm going to hit R, X, and rotate them around. If I hold Control, it will increment the rotation so I can get a nice even 90 degrees. Scale these down. Move them this way. Turn off my X-ray. X to move on the X-axis. I'm going to move into my front perspective. Just line it right up with that pupil. Scale it down. Move it in just a bit. And okay, I can change this later, but for now, it's good that I moved it in edit mode, because now what I can do is I can add a modifier to mirror it over. So what I can do is I can go over here to this wrench and click add modifier. And in Blender, modifiers are basically non-destructive ways to do different things with your geometry. So I can do a mirror, and it mirrors it over according to the origin. And then I can go back into edit mode, and you can see it only lets me edit the left side. And then if anything I do to the left side happens to the right side instantly. It's a great way to work symmetrically and non-destructively. So going back one more time, I'm going to move this back over. And that's pretty good. And anytime I want to change that, I can go back to my edit mode with that selected. But for now, I'm going to go back to object mode, select my sculpt, and then go back into sculpt mode. And now with those eyes in place, I can start to kind of model around those, or sculpt around those. The eyes in mind. What we want to do is kind of make actual eyelids around those. Remember when going in and out of sculpt mode to check your Dyn Topo, because it probably got turned off, as it did for me. I think I want to get more detail, so I'm going to bump this up to 30. Going back to my front view. Can use my grab tool to move this around and just try and get that eyelid to match up with what I've drawn. Really kind of feel out that eyelid lid shape. It's probably going to turn back and it's going to look terrible. That's okay. Go here, go to my pinch tool. You do a bit of smoothing and pinch. Smooth and pinch. Smooth, pinch, back and forth. Add a bit back in. Certainly not perfect, but it's a start. From there, I can define that brow more with my clay strips tool. Go out here. And if I hold control, I can subtract. Back in is smooth. Can come back in with my crease tool. Start to define an eyelid. Get an under eyelid as well. It's all just a push and pull. You can use the control function to get that sharp edge again with your crease tool, the eyelid. You can even use the crease tool in this orthographic view, right along where I've sort of drawn the eyelid there. Kind of simulate that. I might like how that looks, but I might want to adjust it. Remember, one of the big challenges to this whole process is you are going from a 2D design to a 3D design, and so you need to be sort of making adjustments as you go to figure out how that actually translates from 2D to 3D. I'm sure you all can think of examples where they took a 2D character and brought them into 3D and it looked great or it looked terrible. Brow's a little intense. I'm going to smooth it out. Later I will model out the eyebrows, but I'm fine without eyebrows for now. I'm going to bring some of her cheek in here. I'm going to go along that zygomatic arch. Retain. Sometimes it's nice to kind of paint in your anatomy, and then you can smooth it back out again. Cutting away from her sides here, it looks like her skull's kind of wider than the design. I'll go back and smooth it. Am I going with my control crease tool? Just going in and defining this jaw here. I want a stylized line here. That's way too much, but I can go back and sort of smooth it out again. I'll probably smooth this out. At least I've got kind of a defined jaw now that I can work with. It's definitely too much over here. I'm going to go to my elastic deform, kind of pull those in. try and get that taper of the jaw. Kind of comes together to the chin, flaring out here. Let me go back to my clay strips tool. Add that a little more. Well, it seems like I'm going back and forth on this jawline. I mean, the problem is not that, it's that this part is too wide. I also haven't really defined my neck yet. I'm gonna use my sculpt draw. Just gonna start out here. Add more and more. I've got kind of the base of a neck there. Just keep adding and smoothing. I think in my design I may have drawn the neck a lot wider on the side view than the front and back view. That's something I may find that I need to adjust in my sculpt from the design. Kind of pull back these eyelids a bit. Have them meet the design here, so they sort of wrap around the eyes. I'll come back in. My clay strips, put that up again. Or maybe I will use my sculpt draw. And the crease. So I'm going to shape that nose a little bit. Crease tool is very good for that sort of crease in the nose. Go into the nostrils. Make this real small. You don't need to go super deep for the nostrils. We're probably not going to look straight up your character's nostrils. And then texturing, you can make it dark in there. I think maybe I've ended up with a bit too wide of a nose. I'm going to grab just little parts of it, try and pull it back in. Noses are pretty challenging, so don't be discouraged if it takes you a while to get the nose looking just right. I'm going to go in with my crease tool. Just kind of start getting my shape in, so at least know where that's going to be. I'm going to come with my clay strips. Start adding top and bottom. Smoothing out. Smoothing out. Just going back and forth. Thinking like a little bit more detail. Make it 40. Use your grab tool. You pull out a little bit. But that's not going to work out very well. Your chin's definitely very pointy here. Use my crease tool, kind of reshape this a bit and soften it out. Bit better. Smooth out. I'm going to smooth out some of this very hard jawline. Don't really need it that much anymore. I want a little shape to the chin though, so I'll use my crease tool to kind of get an edge there for now at least. It's been a while. I've definitely forgotten to save in a while, so I'm going to hit save, add the plus, save as. I'm going to try and fix this jaw real quick. So I keep making it very, very wide, a lot wider than my original design called for. Try and pull this all in. Sheep's having this sort of alien quality to her though as I pull in her jaw, so I might need to account for that somehow. It might be that her eyes are too big now. Oh yeah, her eyes have definitely gotten way too big. So I'm gonna come in back in. shape them around my original drawings. Alright, now I think I'm going to try and tackle these ears. So, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by laying in some clay strips to sort of guide me on where this ear is going to go. I'm going to use snake hook to really pull them out. Pull them out to about there. Go to my side view. Just really kind of feel it out a bit. And it looks really bad to start right now, but we'll just keep hammering away at it and get it looking right. I can kind of smooth it out. Back in here. A lot of smoothing. So it appears that my snake hook tool has given me some very strange artifacts. So I'm going to need to approach this with a couple different tools to see what the problem is. I'm trying to smooth this out right now and sort of add and subtract geometry to see if those little holes go away. But it doesn't seem to be doing anything, so I suspect there is a problem underneath the model as well. I'm also using the inflate tool to see if that has any effect, which it doesn't seem to. I'm also going to try a detail flood, which I can access up here in the Dine Topo dropdown. And that basically just floods my mesh with the exact same detail to make sure everything's the same resolution. But that still has not solved my problem. So looking inside of my mesh, I can see where more of the problem is. It appears that my mesh has sort of inverted on itself and made all these weird bubbles inside. So I'm trying to smooth these out, and it's helping a little bit, but I don't think that's going to fully solve my problem. I'm going to need some greater solution to fix this. You could also use a tool I didn't talk about earlier called the Simplify tool. It is right here. You can click that. You can go over your mesh and it will simplify things, and it looks like it really fixes some of those strange deformations. Go and use it on the inside as well. Do a bit of smoothing, and the problem area is fixed. So if you've got some weird geometry, go ahead and use the Simplify tool. That might help you out. Now we're at a point where we can really start zipping through. We've seen all the tools and how they're used, so it's really just a matter of persistence and push and pull to get to the desired look. The eyes are something you really want to spend a lot of time on. Really at every stage. The eyes are pretty complicated. The eyelids are something that are going to need special attention. There's a lot of areas when we take this into Maya to sort of resurface or retopologize. There's going to be several areas that you need to do in a very particular way. So it's good to be very particular about this sculpt as well. Just having a very defined eyelid. At some point we want to see what's going on behind your eyes. So you can go over here. I should give this a new name. Let's call this head. Let's call this eye. Hide my eye in my head. I just want to make sure, kind of give myself enough space in the socket here. Really, the socket's not going to matter as much. Look on the inside. Because we're not going to model out this whole thing when we redo this in Maya. And then once you're ready to bring your eyes back, you can click up here to bring them back. Now, if you're getting to the stage and you are worried that your character is not as anatomically detailed as the character that I'm working on, that's okay. I did not make this assignment with the expectation that everyone would be making highly anatomical characters. I really just want you guys to make characters that are detailed enough that they can be rigged properly, but I really don't expect like super detailed humans. I really want you guys to just make characters that are appropriate for your skill level and appropriate for the amount of time that you have to work on this assignment. If this kind of sculpting work is something you are really interested in, I would certainly look into ZBrush, which is a program dedicated to just this kind of CG sculpting. I didn't want to start us out on ZBrush in this class just because it's a very intensive program, and I feel like Blender's tools are a little bit easier to grasp as a beginner. But ZBrush is a very, very robust sculpting program that can do a lot more than even Blender in terms of sculpting. So if this work really interests you, definitely take a look at ZBrush. Also, if you have the time, I would say take a traditional sculpting class with clay. Sculpting was actually one of the very first courses that I took in college, and it has greatly affected the trajectory of my career. And what I learned in that class, I still apply to pretty much everything I do when it comes to 3D. If you enjoy this, sculpting digitally, and you want more experience with it, and you've got the time, then consider taking a sculpting class. When we take this into Maya, we are going to actually leave the mouth just ever so slightly open. Just enough that there's a little separation in the lips. That way we can see what's going on when we model inside and out, or when we're rigging inside and out. Because it's going to be important to have just like the tiniest separation. If you are worried about getting every last little detail of this smoothed out and perfect, you don't necessarily have to make things about this absolutely perfect, because we are going to retopologize this, which basically means we are going to redo the surface in a lower resolution so that it can be more workable and we can have greater control over the geometry. But we want the general shape of this still. So if there are little tiny flaws, you don't necessarily have to fix everything on this, because we're going to take another pass at this in Maya. Because this sculpt is made up of like millions of triangles, practically. Hundreds of thousands at least. We would not want to have even a fraction of that many triangles in our rig, because that would be impossible to animate with. Okay, so this is getting pretty close. So I'm going to go ahead and start on the hair now. To do that, I'm going to need to go to object mode so I can add another sphere to the scene. So I go to add, mesh, UV sphere. And it seems to have put it in a weird spot. So I'm going to go to my object properties, the orange square here on the right. I'll click that, and I'm going to drag select all these boxes and hit 0. And it'll zero out the location on X, Y, and Z. We'll hit G to grab, hit Z to move up on the Z axis. And then I'm just going to scale this a little bit on the Y. Let's go again on the scale again on the Z. Scale the X. And then we're going to go back to sculpt mode. Make sure Dyn Topo is on. I'm going to lower my detail for now. And then from that, we can just start sculpting. Oh, make sure you have your symmetry back on as well. Alright, it's not perfect now, but it is getting pretty close. If this were an instance where we were taking the high poly sculpt and making a normal map out of it, I would want to make this completely perfect. But we're not doing that for this assignment. We're just using this as a base for our modeling. Also, this tutorial has gotten very long, so I'm anxious to get this exported. With more time, I probably would have wanted to perfect the hair, but for the time being, this is good enough, and any corrections I want to make, I can make, and we take it into Maya. So the last step to do is to exit my sculpt mode, go to object mode, select my eye. I'm going to go ahead and confirm my mirror. To do that, I go over to my modifiers with the wrench, and I go to this drop down right here, and I hit apply. And that essentially confirms the mirror. It makes it permanent. Then I'm going to select my eyes, my head, and my hair with shift left click. I'm going to go to file. I'm going to hit export. I'm going to go down to FBX. And because Maya is Y up, I'm going to leave that there. Leave it as a scale of 1. I'm going to limit my selection to selected objects. And I'm going to give this a different name. I'm going to take out the initial and the number. I'm just going to call it head sculpt. And then I'm going to export FBX. Now, an FBX is basically a file type that a lot of different 3D software can understand. It is proprietary to Autodesk, but Blender understands what an FBX is. Game engines understand what an FBX is. It's basically a very universal file type. So you can kind of think of a FBX as like the JPEG of 3D software. So now that I have saved an FBX of my model, I'm going to go ahead and open Maya. I'm going to make sure that my project is set by going to set project. I'm going to select character project, and I'm going to set it to that. And then I'm going to not open scene. This time I'm going to import. And from there, I can select my head sculpt FBX, and I can import that. And just like that, there is my high poly sculpt. As you can see, it is extremely high poly and it's all triangles. So there's nothing much we can do with this exact model, but we're going to use this as the base for our low poly version of this head. But that we will handle next week. So until then, good luck sculpting and have a good week.